Conflict is in many ways the driving theme of Warhammer Fantasy, and as such, there are a bunch of important rivalries that kind of define the setting. The Kingdoms of Humanity against the Dark Gods, the three-way war between the Dwarfs, Greenskins, and Skaven, the Tomb Kings against Vampirism, and the Legions of Nagash. But one element of the narrative I've always found particularly fascinating, ever since I was first introduced to this universe, is the relationship between the Elven races and Chaos. Specifically, the Dark Prince Slaanesh and its lust for High Elf, Dark Elf, and Wood Elf souls. So today, we're going to explore the relationship between this thirsting goddess of painful pleasure and the elves, what attracts him to their essence, and how that conflict has manifested into one of the more interesting and iconic rivalries in all of Warhammer Fantasy lore, a conflict with roots buried all the way back in the dawn ages of civilization, during the first great coming of chaos. Many thousands of years ago, when the Old Ones first began forging life, the Elves became one of their first great triumphs on this plane of existence, quickly achieving a high level of civilization and fully understanding the dangers of corruption. This eldest race established themselves as a world power at a time when humans were still pretty much crawling in the primordial ooze, and their talents for nation building and inherent control over magic led their kingdom to prosper and flourish. But all was not well, and as the warp gates collapsed and demons flooded into the mortal plane, it was the elves and the lizardmen who fought on the front lines against an endless tide of horrors from the void. It was in this time of Aenarion the Defender, the champion of their race, that the elves fought a long and brutal war, not just for their own survival, but for the very existence of the world itself, and with a steady supply of sentient creatures being hacked apart and consigned to oblivion, it was also at this time that Slaanesh grew to treasure elven souls above all else. Because there wasn't much to do with dead lizardmen. They're not exactly an emotive race. They don't have free time or really even free will. There was nothing for the Dark Prince to feed upon there, but within the souls of dead elves, there was a feast fit for a king. As Slaanesh grew in power from the Great War, the fate of the Spirit became a massive point of contention for the elves. They realized that even in death, there would be no sanctuary, that being tortured for eternity in the circles of seduction was not a particularly appealing proposition. So they had to devise a way to protect themselves once they were shuffled from this mortal coil. We're going to blur the timeline a bit here to get the point across, but where the High Elves and Wood Elves used waystones and elemental creatures to shield their people in the afterlife, the Dark Elves created no such defense. They were, and still are, completely capable of devising one, of course, but refused to surrender their beings to a half-life of dulled senses and diminished sensation. The knowledge that oblivion awaited only spurred them towards a wilder, more callous existence, because they believed a life lived without limits or censure was their only compensation. Which is not to say that all Dark Elf souls met their end as nectar for thirsting Slaanesh when they eventually expired. Aerith Kiel, the Pale Queen, was always eager to acquire elves to slave for her in the underworld, and other damned souls are occasionally rescued by Loek the Trickster as well. Doesn't happen a lot, but it's frequent enough to kindle some hope of salvation. So within these sentient races, you might see why Slaanesh prizes elven souls so highly. These are beings that live for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, that have experienced just about all there is to experience, that have reached the highest peaks of pleasure and the deepest sorrows of overwhelming loss in their long existence. These are people that live for so long, they become so burnt out on emotional baggage, experience, and existence in general, that they just kind of give up on living. They don't really die of old age or disease. There's no such thing as Lewy body dementia, rheumatoid arthritis, or liver cancer in Elven society, nor do they tend to grow wrinkly or stoop with age. There are a few characters as living contradictions there, Hellebrand of course being a prime example, but by and large, when they die, they become hollow and depressed and just fade away, looking like the supermodel asses they always were. To combat these super high highs and incredibly deep lows, much of Azure society is built upon regimented perfection. Because they can feel so acutely, both physically and emotionally, they need discipline and structure to avoid the pitfalls that come with pushing those to their extremes. Which isn't to say they don't like to party and live lavish lifestyles. They very much do. They still drink, they still have sex, judge each other, and on occasion kill each other, but through the pursuit of perfection, they can better themselves and society and avoid the pitfalls of hedonism and depravity. Or at least that's the idea. Very tough balance to strike there, which is why Slaanesh and the Elves can be seen as two sides of the same coin. That Azure, Druchii, and Azrai souls are always teetering on that precipice with the greedy mouth of a god waiting just below the drop to consume them. Gee, wonder why the fall of the Eldar in 40k so closely mirrors fantasy in that way. All of that to say, this is why Slaanesh, more than any other Chaos God, so often turns its attention to the glittering kingdom of Ulthuan, which is where N'Kari enters our story. Now, N'Kari, the Keeper of Secrets, has a long, murderous history with the Elves of Ulthuan. He slaughtered thousands in his prosecution of the Long War and very nearly killed the Phoenix King twice during those conflicts. But both times he failed, and that's where his hatred of the Elves truly began. Because Aenarion the Defender killed him twice in those Dawn Ages, and in fact the second time was at the climax of the Battle for the Vortex, where demons were finally banished from the mortal plane for good-ish. Aenarion's last stand was epic, and if you ever had any doubts about who the greatest melee fighter in the history of the Warhammer world is, he and his mount Dragnir took on a Bloodthirster, a Great Unclean One, Kairos Fateweaver, and N'Kari simultaneously, killing all four and returning the Sword of Cain to the Blighted Isle before finally succumbing to their wounds. During that battle, the Keeper of Secrets had his heart ripped from his chest, his own acid blood spewed back into his own eyes, and he was impaled by the Widowmaker, reduced to the barest nub of sentience by the godlike power of the sword, and Aenarion's godlike skill in the face of overwhelming adversity. If N'Kari had been discovered in this state by any of the Archmages still channeling the Vortex, he would have been obliterated for all eternity, but had the presence of mind to keep hidden and bide his time to regain his strength, something that would take him the better part of 6,000 years. That long vacation gave him plenty of time to stew on his losses and plot his vengeance on those who shared in Aenarion's blood. His first chance would come during the pillaging of Ulthuan, only a few short years after the birth of the twins Tyrion and Teclis, when in the span of a single month, he used an extensive cabal of Slaaneshi cultists and a series of portals to wreak havoc all across the island continent. This rather unpleasant expedition culminated in a showdown at the Shrine of Aenarion, where the twins enlisted the help of the Phoenix Guard and the magical heat of the flame itself to weaken N'Kari enough to banish him back to the realms of chaos. But unlike the duel with Aenarion, this was only a momentary setback, and it would not be long before the Keeper returned to the mortal plane, albeit not entirely of his own accord. Remember that on both sides of the Sundering, the Dark Elves and the High Elves are led by heirs of Aenarion. Tyrion and Teclis are the great-great-great-great-grandsons of the Defender, while Malekith the Witch King, of course, is his son. And Alarielle the Everqueen, being descended from Aenarion's daughter Yvraine, is also Malekith's distant niece. It's one big incestuous family tree, and all of them felt the curse of N'Kari, but only one of them sought to bind it to their will and own advantage. Malekith, being the evil bastard that he is, felt that a Keeper of Secrets with a long history of hating Ulthuani would be a very useful tool in destabilizing the region once more, in preparation for his own invasion. So he summoned N'Kari with a dark, sinful ritual, baited him into the mortal plane, and then closed the vice with all his arcane power, essentially binding the demon to his will and forcing him into servitude. That story arc would come to a head near Avalorn, where the greater demon hunted for Alarielle the Everqueen and was ultimately banished once more when the runes of binding that tethered N'Kari to Malekith were broken, and he was scorched from this plane by Teclis and his arcane might for the second time. Beginning to sound a bit like Starscream at this point, greater demons are cataclysmic, world-ending threats until they have to actually face a protagonist, and then they get their ass beat like a conga drum. And believe me, it gets worse for our old friend N'Kari, because after Malekith lost control of Slaanesh's Great Keeper, he faced down Tyrion, Teclis, and the High Elf army at the Battle of Finneval Plains near the coastline of Sapphire. This is one of the most important battles in the history of the Elves, and had it gone poorly for the Azur, the Dark Elves' massive three-pronged assault would have led directly to the conquest of Caledor, Lothern, the White Tower of Hoeth, and the ascension of a new Phoenix King in Ulthuan, not to mention the purging and likely genocide of essentially every great High Elf and many of the underlings too. But Teclis once again proved his worth as one of the greatest mages in history, awakening the flames of Aenarion deep within Malekith's blood and turning him into a roasty, toasty marshmallow once more. To save himself from the fires consuming him, Malekith was forced to fling his essence into the realms of chaos to escape, where he came face to face with, you guessed it, a very angry N'Kari, now no longer bound into slavery. And at the foot of the Martyr Fortress in Slaanesh territory, they clashed in a battle of might and magic. Now, this was the first time Malekith faced the demon in single combat, but it would not be the last. And in fact, the Witch King barely made it out alive, because he was contending with a particularly hostile environment, a powerful greater demon hell-bent on vengeance, and his own weakened flesh after being nearly killed by Teclis. But he did manage to escape and return to his homeland, although much of his invasion force on Ulthuan was not quite so lucky. Some centuries later, the night of pleasure and pain was hoppin' and boppin' in Naggaroth, a night where sex, drugs, and rock and roll were observed to their absolute limit in tribute to authority, and some dumbass managed to summon an army of demonettes led by Nakari, who at this point was probably pretty tired of being pounded by the Bloodline of Aenarion. Once again, he almost managed to kill Malekith, grabbing him in his massive pincer claws, but a well-timed Doombolt and cascade of black lightning staggered him long enough for the Witch King to break free, then decapitate the demon with a mighty blow from Destroyer. All told, more than a half-dozen times bested by this most royal of elven bloodlines and banished to the warp. So why does Nakari hate the Bloodline of Aenarion, especially when we made it clear just how much Slaanesh loves them and desires their souls? Well, besides the obvious, getting killed by them a whole hell of a lot of times, it's because they're the only beings that never gave him what he wanted. He couldn't torture them, he couldn't derive pleasure from their disembodied souls, he couldn't defeat them in duels. His pursuit of perfection always came screeching to a halt in that most unpleasant of ways when faced with their superiority. And there is nothing in this world, nor in the realms of chaos, that makes the Keeper of Secrets more upsetty spaghetti than that nagging feeling of inferiority. It is anathema to them and everything they stand for. Their pride, jealousy, and hubris simply cannot handle that kind of humiliation once, let alone 6 times. So you could say Nakari's hatred of the Bloodline of Aenarion is in his blood, much of which has been shed in the holiest of elven sanctuaries, from Naggaron to the Shrine of Azurion. And that is why Nakari, for all the fun he's had on Ulthuan and Naggaroth, absolutely despises the elves, while his patron god Slaanesh absolutely adores them.